As mentioned in that intro, one of my many interests is architectural history. So I was told that some of you might be interested in architecture because a lot of the presentations are mostly about art or painting and photography. So chose to do this one here about resolving contradictions in Frank Lloyd Wright's Ennis house. So we'll just get right into it. Let's see here. There we go. Okay. So Frank Lloyd Wright is known as one of the world's pioneering masters of modern architecture. He's widely claimed to be America's greatest, most influential architect, and much of how architecture is designed and built today stems from Wright, from his ideas, his experiments, his structures, and in particular, his architectural philosophy. His most well-known residence is probably this house here. This is the Kaufman House. Or better known as Falling Water. And this house really showcases most of the tenets of Wright's architectural philosophy and what would later become known as organic architecture, okay? So here in Bear Run, Pennsylvania, it's a semi-mountainous, very rocky region. And Wright, when he was building this house, quarried local stone from the site to build the home. So you see here all the stacked stone, that's from the site itself. And so he's drawing material from the site, he's quoting from the landscape, which will be a major part of the organic style and Wright's architectural philosophy. In general, you see this dominance of the horizontal. Wright is attempting and I think does a very good job at integrating the house into the landscape. So originally, the Kaufmans, the clients here, thought they would like their home to be placed sort of below this gentle waterfall here, okay, kind of where this photograph was probably taken. They thought they should put their house down here so they could look up at the beautiful waterfall. And they also, if you can see this rock right here, they loved that rock. It was their favorite rock to have picnics on, okay? So that's what they thought. Wright thought differently. Instead, he just plops the entire structure directly over the picnicking rock, but he doesn't want to lose access to the landscape. And so he suspends a staircase down to the stream below. So in doing so, the structure is really completely integrated into the site. Frank Lloyd Wright is so conscious of the landscape, even so much so that he sent his architectural students to get very specific measurements from the site to record every tree, every bush. Oh, I should say here, this is the interior view going down the stairs to the suspended staircase. So he sends students to go get these very specific measurements, and he accommodates nature here. So even here, this beam with this niche in it to accommodate this growing tree in the center. Or even the rocks here, these three large rocks by the fireplace, those were there before they built the house. And he just leaves nature where it is and builds around it and incorporates it into his design. So very organic, very accommodating of the landscape, which means this house is not able to go everywhere, right? It's very site specific. Okay. On the interior, there are lots and lots of windows. Wright wants to bring nature in, bring the outside in. And Wright is designing most, if not all, of the furniture and the decor here. Even he designs a dinnerware set for this house to ensure that all parts of the home harmonize with the whole of it. So in Wright's mind, it is all an entirely one composition. All of those are part of his architectural philosophy, but how did he arrive at this philosophy? To answer this question, I think it's important to contextualize it within what was going on in architecture at the time and in history. So Wright, he started practicing architecture at the very end of the 19th century and into the beginning of the 20th century. And he apprentices at this man's studio. This is Louis Sullivan, and he's apprenticing with his studio in Chicago. Okay, and it's the premier architectural studio there. Chicago had experienced multiple fires towards the end of the 19th century, so there was a need and also space for lots of building to happen. And Sullivan's motto here, as you can see, is form follows function, meaning that the form or the shape of the building should relate to its function, okay? Even its exterior appearance should relate to the function of the building. Here at the Carson Peary Scott building. Now it's known as the Sullivan Center. This building really displays Sullivan's motto of form follows function. Okay, so let's talk about the function. The function of this building was a department store on the lower two levels that you see down here, and then up above were their offices, various business offices, okay? And you notice, and you can see the detail here of the entrance, that these lower two levels are articulated with these tendril-like forms. It's very organic. They're very soft lines, very much Art Nouveau, that type of style, on this bottom two layers. And that was to appeal to the shoppers, because who are the shoppers? They are women. Okay, so that was to appeal to them. And then up above are the more squarish geometric forms, sort of stripped down of any real decor. And that is to reflect the men workers working above the department store. Okay, so here at Sullivan's architectural studio that Wright is apprenticing, Wright gets promoted very quickly. Sullivan realizes Wright's potential, and he promotes him to head of domestic design in 1891. And in this position, Wright designs 6 houses for Sullivan, but he also moonlighted 10 for himself. So Wright gets fired for that trespass, but he had already made a name for himself. So he's ready to expand out with his own style. So Wright obviously leaves Sullivan's studio, but he takes with him Sullivan's motto of form follows function. And he starts to add to this idea with other concepts and other beliefs. And these beliefs will lead him to a new style called his prairie style. And that's illustrated here at the Roby House, also in Chicago. The lot on which this house is built is very long and rectangular. So Wright then designs the form, the shape of the house to be long and rectangular as well. The house is 110 feet long. Here again, he prefers the horizontal to the vertical, and he even uses very broad Roman bricks, which are longer than the bricks that we have nowadays. So the broad horizontals of the Roman bricks on the exterior really emphasize the relationship that this home has not only with its lot, with this specific site, but also with the surrounding plains. Here, we're here in the Midwest, so we want this horizontality, which really reflects Wright's almost obsession with his idea that any structure should grow from the landscape. In fact, it must grow from the landscape, he says. So the Roma bricks also, this isn't a great photo of it to show you, but it creates an alternating pattern of cavity, solid, okay? And that's echoed by sort of the layering elements you see, in particularly on the corners of these negative and positive elements, the projection and the recession pattern coming back and forth. And that patterning of contrast would become very basic in his prairie style, and also reflects Wright's tenet of incorporating contrast as an architectural element into all of his designs. Wright said, "Shadow is of the light," meaning every work should have a contrast of positive and negative elements, light and dark, public and private, projection, recession, that sort of thing. Looking at the plan of the Roby House, the interior of the home is actually mostly an open layout, which was pretty new for this time period, 1908. So this is actually the lower part here is the main level. It's got the living room and dining room, which are only separated by a staircase, but there's no doors, no walls in between it, and it's lined completely down here with windows. Wright said that architects should create unified interior spaces. He said we should abolish boxes within boxes. And he also said that halls are just a waste of space, really evidence to him of bad design, that you're not uniting the interior space if you have a hall. So Wright also personally designed the stained glass windows that you see here. And the design, you notice, is mostly just on the upper half, okay? And that's because from the exterior looking in, you would only be able to see the upper half of the window. So what he does is obscure that with the stained glass windows, right? He obscures the view from the outside, which then offers more privacy for his clients without sacrificing light, okay? Because he wants that light to come in. The use of stained glass really softens and sort of filters the outdoor light and shows to me the ultimate influence that nature had on Wright. He wanted to bring the outside in. He also designed the furniture for this home. Wright believed that all components should contribute to that harmonious whole. And he says here in organic architecture, then, it is quite impossible to consider the building as one thing, its furnishings another, and its setting and environment still another. The spirit in which these buildings are conceived sees all these together at work as one thing. Okay, so all of these ideas that Wright is now collecting and coming up with on his own, Wright's ideas about form follows function and a unified interior space and our harmonious whole will heavily influence many European architects who will take these ideas from Wright, but then run in a completely different direction. Okay, this is one of these architects. This is Le Corbusier, of France, and he had a copy of Wright's Wasmuth portfolio that you see here, which was a book printed in Germany that contained 100 of Wright's designs and also had a monograph. So Le Corbusier and others use the idea of form follows function, but instead of articulating and decorating a building according to its function, like Wright would have done, many of these European modernist architects will just strip the building bare of articulation in favor of what they call a pureness of form, okay? And this is what they end up with. This is the Villa Savoy in France. Le Corbusier designed this building. And Le Corbusier creates this, and he calls it a machine for living. So we're not doing natural here. Now we're doing machines, okay? A design that was the epitome of efficiency, basically just strict functionalism. Okay. Le Corbusier wanted his architecture to be so efficiently designed and so functionally built that you, as the resident, would be more efficient yourself just by living there, okay? And you can see, instead of integrating the house into the landscape, it's placed on stilts to raise it off the ground. It's not connected to its location. It's not site-specific, which is the opposite of what Wright's architectural philosophy is. Rather, this type of architecture was meant to be applicable everywhere and to anyone. The interior of this space is just starkly geometric, very streamlined. The interior really appears almost as a very clean, sterile environment, not particularly inviting, but very efficient, right? And the only curve almost in the whole interior is here in the bathroom, okay? The furniture, too, that would have decorated this house, Le Corbusier didn't design it himself, but the furniture is designed with the same ideas in mind, to be highly functional, little to no ornamentation, and able to be mass produced so anyone could use it. This style that we're looking at here is called the international style because it spread internationally. And really that's enabled by the premise that it wasn't site specific, right? It can go anywhere. You have to understand too that in Europe at this time, they were dealing with a different set of circumstances than the US. So World War I had really devastated Europe in general, but France in particular. And a lot of destruction had occurred there, so much so that there was this desperate need for housing after the war. They needed a quick way to build housing for people. They needed mass-produced architecture and furnishings, okay? And they do not want to bring the outside in. It's all been destroyed. Why would you want to look out your window at rubble desolated by war, okay? So you can see just by contrasting these two homes, there's a major difference between American and European architectural approaches, particularly Wright's architectural approach and his philosophy. So you see the organic style on the left versus the international style here on the right. Now, there will be some architects that will pick up there's some American architects that will pick up on the international style, but Frank Lloyd Wright never does. Okay. He was absolutely disgusted with the international style. He accused the style of being, quote, nothing more than flat-chested architecture. So Wright is never one to mince words. He says a lot of things. So Wright never conforms to the internationalist ideas, but even though some of their opinions did overlap, such as their concept of open interior space. So instead, Wright is going to seek for a thoroughly American architecture that's unique, okay? He believes that there is, he calls it a single true way of architecture, okay? So hopefully by this little introduction, we get a sense of Wright's architectural philosophy. And he said, there is no architecture without a philosophy. There is no art of any kind without its own philosophy. So let's look at Wright's philosophy here. And this is not all of the tenets of his philosophy, but a selected number of them. And we'll see how many we get through. So as I mentioned, he believes that there is a single true way of architecture, a universal architecture, not one style, but a philosophy, okay? He believes that form follows function, right? Architecture should be personalized to the function of the space, how that space functions for the client. He believes it should be site-specific. So site will influence the size, shape, even the material of the structure. He's going to use materials from the various sites. Architecture, according to Wright, should be organic and natural. Above all, Wright believes that architecture is an abstraction of nature, and that's nature with a capital N, okay? Meaning nature is supreme in Wright's mind. He believes that buildings should grow up from the landscape. They should be subtly integrated into the site and reflect the nature around it. Wright also said that no house should ever be on a hill or anything. It should be of the hill, belonging to it. Hill and house should live together, each the happier for the other, okay? And then he also says that you need to use natural materials, okay, like wood and things like that. He also believes in continuity as part of this organic tenet, which when he talks about continuity, he means a unity between exterior and interior, that the outside should be brought in, that there should be a continuity between those two spaces, and also that there should be a continuity among interior spaces, okay, that the interior should also be unified. Remember, he says abolish boxes within boxes and eliminate those hallways, that sort of thing. He also believes in contrast, that every work should have that contrast of positive and negative elements. Like he said, shadow itself is of the light. He also believes that architecture should be a harmonious whole. So if we were going to write a mathematical equation of what Wright thinks of as what is architecture, it would be architecture equals space plus structure, plus interior design, plus products, okay? All the components are going to contribute to the whole. And this is why he's designing furniture, dinnerware. He even designed napkins for one of his homes, okay? He also believes that the architecture should be original and unique. So Wright was famous for claiming, I never borrow, okay? He told his young architectural students, he said, forget the architecture of the world, except as something good in their own way and in their time. Okay, so a little condescending about like everyone else's architecture, but this was his philosophy, okay? So with this architectural philosophy, how did Frank Lloyd Wright end up with this structure? Okay, this is his Ennis house in Los Angeles, California, and at first glance, it appears less than organic. It doesn't appear to be integrated into the site, but rather very much projecting from it. It's like a fortress dominating the mountain rather than subtly growing from the landscape, okay? And the house is made almost entirely of concrete, which is a very man-made material, not a very natural material. Concrete typically is used to remove dwellings from the natural elements. Think of a foundation for a house, right? A concrete foundation. It removes it from the ground. It doesn't unite the structure with its natural surroundings. So also here, Wright claimed he never borrowed, but there's an obvious borrowing here from the architecture of the world that Wright told everyone else to forget. In this case, we'll look at it later, the specific precedent is Maya architecture. So all of this appears to be really incongruent with Wright's self-proclaimed architectural philosophy, okay? And if Wright is so adamant that there is a single true way of architecture that exists, then these inconsistencies really shouldn't occur within his buildings, right? Wright, though, he firmly believed that regardless of style, his works always maintained the tenets of his philosophy, because according to Wright, his architecture, it was that single true way of architecture that he believes in. So at the Ennis house, here at the Ennis house, did Wright stay true to his architectural principles, or did he contradict them? So we're going to go into a deeper investigation of the house's structure, design, ornamentation, to see how Wright attempted to resolve these apparent contradictions. And I'll leave it up to you to decide for yourself how effective he was in doing so. So let's first look at the material, right, that he made this building from, the structure of it, and that is concrete. Wright called it the conglomerate named concrete. So Wright actually considered concrete defective, okay? It was worthless in and of itself because it had no inherent form. He said it was the cheapest and ugliest thing in the building world. It lived mostly in the architectural gutter as an imitation of rock face stone. But then he says, why not see what could be done with that gutter rat, okay? So in spite of its flaws, Wright deemed the material at least worthy of exploration and use. And he said that all that needed to be done was to educate the concrete block. So this is a bit longer of a quote, but it really describes the construction style he's using here, okay? So Wright says, we would take that despised outcast of the building industry, the concrete block, out from underfoot and from the gutter, find hitherto unsuspected soul in it, make it live as a thing of beauty, textured like the trees. Yes, the building would be made of the blocks, as a kind of tree itself, standing among other trees in its own native land. All we would have to do is to educate the concrete block, refine it, excuse me, and knit it together with with steel in the joints, and so construct the joints that they could be poured full of concrete after they were set up and a steel strand laid in them. The walls would thus become thin but solid reinforced slabs and yield to any desire imaginable, and common labor could do it all. We would make the walls double, of course, one wall facing inside and the other wall facing outside, thus getting continual hollow space between them. So the house would be cool in summer, warm in winter, and dry always. Okay, so what Wright is describing here is his textile block construction system. Okay, he actually patents this type of construction. It's a new system of construction, and it's based on the 16-inch square concrete block. And that's the method of construction that's used here at the Ennis house. And because of its fabric-like form, it becomes known as the textile block construction system. So, all right. So the key for Wright, though, is the important, very important key is that the concrete blocks were made from decomposed granite, excavated directly from the site, poured into the iron forms on site, and then cured for 10 days on site prior to assembling them into the building fabric, okay? So recognizing this, that the concrete was produced from on-site natural materials, then these 27,000 plus concrete blocks that make up this structure can be considered organic, an organic natural material. And to Wright, they were. And he relied almost exclusively on this natural material to construct the entirety of this project. And he also uses the block to resolve almost all of the philosophical contradictions that have appeared to us at first glance, okay? So, oh, here we go. So let's take the claim then that there should be a continuity between exterior and interior. So the concrete pattern blocks were used on both the interior and exterior walls. Some of the blocks were perforated, meaning they punched holes through them. I think I have, there we go. This gives you a detailed view right here of the perforated blocks with those holes punched in them. And what that allows is there's this greater penetration of light and shadow really across the surface of the building. And so these features of the concrete block system really serve to heighten the connection between interior and exterior, when normally concrete would be a very thick, solid surface that divides interior from exterior. He's trying to achieve that unification instead. He also does this in his effort to bring the outside in. He not only perforates the blocks, but he also uses glass to transform this heavy material, such a heavy material that concrete is, into a lighter partition. So the perforations and the glass allow sort of this blending of the interior and exterior. So by choosing concrete as his medium, Wright combines both the architectural elements of construction and composition, of structure and form, of material and space. And with concrete, Wright really stretched the limits of this material and structure. And he stretched them so much so that the house was actually marked structurally unstable even before it was completed. There were structural problems that arose in most of his concrete block houses. He did 4 in California during the early 1920s. So many of the concrete blocks in the lower sections of the wall began to crack and buckle under tension. And then later on, there were earthquakes and heavy rains, and then there were attempts to preserve and restore the blocks, but that actually accelerated the deterioration. So the poor Ennis house damaged like this for so long. And it was only after decades and decades, basically of neglect, that the Ennis house was sold by the foundation that owned it, which was a nonprofit organization. They just couldn't raise the funds to care for the Ennis house as needed. So they sell it to a private party who then finally restored it. They sold it in 2009, I believe, to Ron Burkle is his name. But so he finally restores it. So, but despite the deterioration, right, of the concrete blocks, Wright's, at least his originality of the use of the concrete block in the Ennis house, that can't be refuted, I don't think. But I'm not so sure that it is entirely unique, okay? Because what I think can't be refuted as well is the definite use of precedents for this home. So Wright said, I never borrow, but there's a definite borrowing here. And it's quite obvious. It's Maya architecture, pre-Columbian architecture in general. So at first glance, this Ennis house really appears very similar to sort of the imposing fortresses that are set on hills, similar to a Maya temple. And so even though Wright, he was telling his students, forget the architecture of the world, but it's very apparent, especially at the Ennis house, that Wright never ignored the architecture of the world, but rather incorporated it into his designs. So we know that Wright was at least minimally aware of pre-Columbian architecture as early as 1892. And that's when he attended Chicago's World Columbian Exposition. And there he saw full-size casts of monuments from this ancient Maya site of Uxmal. Okay. And he saw this building here, the nunnery in particular. It wasn't a nunnery for the Maya. It's just called that, which is another topic. So anyway, so this experience strongly impressed Wright, and he began incorporating pre-Columbian elements into his work. As early as 1895, we have evidence of that. So here at the Ennis house, though, what he does to add these more Maya / pre-Columbian elements is he uses corbel vaulting in the entryway. And I apologize, I have not been able to get a good image of the entryway, mostly because the house has been closed for a long, long time. So, but there's corbel vaulting in the entryway, and then he also uses the battered walls, which are sloped. Okay, can you see that here? As opposed to being straight up vertical, they are sloped. We call that battered walls, and that's reflective of Maya architecture. Now, Wright, he knows this, right? And so he claims that these components are, he says, they're not pastiches or polished quotations. He calls them syntheses, okay, that concurred with his theory of a universal architecture. Okay, so Wright took what he considered to be eternal about pre-Columbian architecture and incorporated it into his design. So Wright will use his word, he synthesized not only Mesoamerican elements at the Ennis house, but other exotic influences as well. This image on the right, this is a Potala in Tibet, which is the Dalai Lama's residence. This looks similar to his design for the Ennis house as well. And this association is actually confirmed by the fact that Wright had a photograph of the palace, the Potala, mounted on a wall in his Taliesin studio. And this was the only photo, the only picture of a building not designed by Wright that he had in his studio. Okay, so he thinks very much of this building, at least as much as he thought of his own architecture. So, but the Ennis house, so yes, he is taking inspiration from what he calls universal architecture, but that coincides with his philosophy about a single true architecture. So, at first glance, the Ennis house also appears to contradict the belief that a building should grow up from the landscape, be an extension of the site, because the house really seems to just formidably jut out of the mountainside. But in reality, Wright had actually placed the house not on top of the hill, but into its side. He intended to leave a mass of trees. These trees are not on the lot itself, but he intended it to look more like this, so it wouldn't be so monumental. Wright realizes that the textile block system of construction was inherently vertical in nature. So he seeks to overcome this vertical nature and subjugate the system to his preference for horizontality by utilizing certain conventions at the house. One of which is this convention here that he does on the retaining wall. What he does is he alternates plain and then pattern blocks, and he uses the pattern blocks to go all the way across the structure. It's creating this long horizontal line, which makes the structure seem much more elongated and really de-emphasizes its verticality. So he's doing that to overcome and that maybe problem and resolve his own contradiction there. So now let's look at the element of contrast, right? He believes in contrast. So how is contrast then resolved by the use of the concrete block? Here at the Ennis house, Wright uses actually only a single motif on the concrete block. At his other concrete block houses, he uses multiple designs, but here it's just a single motif, which is, as you can see, an asymmetrical composition of these geometric forms with really a strongly negative center and then a single positive corner, And this pattern was mirrored and then rotated to achieve contrast in the house. On the exterior, we've looked here, you can see that these perforated blocks create that light and shade, that play of light and shade, and then the banding wall also gives you more contrast by alternating the plain and the pattern blocks, that opposition of dark and light. The use of pattern is really replete in some areas, and then it's totally absent from others. And that even further contributes to contrast here. Let's see. Okay, so Wright continues the use of this light and dark contrast effect on the interior as well. He combines pattern blocks, perforated blocks, plain blocks throughout the interior, which achieves contrast, and then he uses his signature stained glass to really amplify the contrast, And he also, another example of this is in the entryway. So the entryway of the house is actually down in this dark hole that you see. That's the entryway on the west side of the house. It's actually only 7 feet tall, so quite short and dim, very dim. But after you climb about half a flight of stairs, it opens up into this grand, soaring living room with this large stained glass window that lets light in from the south. And so it hits the colonnade here in the living room, and you can see this in these two photos. That this sort of intense stream of light comes through the glass and strikes the patterned blocks on the colonnade, and it materializes in this very much chiaroscuro effect, almost tenebristic, okay, because you have zones of darkness juxtaposed with blocks of brightness, and it creates this really dramatic interplay of light and shade. It's almost as though the colonnade is this theatrical stage with spotlights. You can see in this image on the right, no electrical lights are on in the house at this time. So all of the light you're seeing coming through, it's almost like spotlights on a stage. It's all natural lighting. And it hits this glittering, almost backdrop here of a mosaic that Wright designed of a tree over the fireplace. And it's very dramatic, okay? So this feeling that you can get when you're in this house, this dramatic feeling is why this is called Wright's Baroque period, okay? Because it's very dramatic. So let's take the tenet now. We kind of checked off contrast. Let's take the tenet now of form follows function. Wright, I feel like Wright conforms to this idea by really characteristically treating the sections of the house according to their function as either a public space or a private space. So in this house, in this case, the public side is on the north, where the house faces the street and is accessed from the road. And then the private side is on the south, which faces the slope of the hill and then further away, the city of Los Angeles. And Wright accounted for this by making the north side actually shorter in elevation with fewer windows, so no one driving by on the street would be able to view into the house. And then on the south side, he makes it very tall in elevation, has lots more windows, generally more open, but no one can see in by virtue of the hill, and then also the massive retaining wall that he has back here. There is, one exception to this, okay, of this form follows function of dividing the house according to private and public sides, and that is the pool. Okay, this is the one exception to this, which is it's paradoxically located on the north side of the house, which is the public side, and swimming was considered more of a private activity. Okay, but the pool actually was added some 20 years later. At the request of the home's fourth owner, John Nesbitt. He actually wrote to Wright to design a swimming pool for the house. So this was added on, but Wright is doing it. So still true to his philosophy, Wright designed the pool on this former terrace area so that it can't be seen from the street. This is the pool looking out to what would be the street. Okay, so he has just a couple of blocks that he stacks up to shield it from the public there. And you can really only see the pool from the sky bridge here. You can just barely see it. The sky bridge spans the entry gate. Okay, so even with all of these efforts to really maintain his tenants, which I think he does for the most part, there is one part of the house that even it's hard for me to justify on how Wright preserved his principles, and that's the hall. Okay, Wright had declared that halls were a waste of space, right? That they were evidence of an interior layout that was not open and unified. But there is an obvious and very long passageway in this house. It leads here from this is the colonnade in the living room, leads clear down here to Mr. Ennis's bedroom, which would now be considered the master bedroom of the house, okay? So, and this is looking back the other way. Now, Wright does line it entirely with windows that look out onto the former terrace, now turned pool area. And actually in the original plans, now this is the plan of this is original, but the writing is not. So don't pay attention to that. But on the original plans, this area here, what we're looking at labeled as number 6, Wright labeled it as a loggia, okay? As though it were this open air covered porch area for the patio. Okay. And also you see in his designs that every single glass panel lining that north side was supposed to be a glass door swinging out open to the terrace. Why and when most of the doors were replaced with windows is unclear. I haven't been able to find that out, but the space in general still functions as a hall, a very beautiful hall, but a hall just the same. So that's the one place where I'm thinking he's stretching a little bit. But overall, Wright, his use of the textile block system at the Ennis house really makes clear to me his ingenuity in resolving the apparent theoretical contradictions that we've seen. So Wright seems to maintain most, if not all, of his architectural tenets through the use of the concrete block. So Wright said of the Ennis house, he said, "The great oppositions of architecture are resolved: horizontal, vertical, monolithic, articulated, heavy, light, solid, void, static, dynamic, open, closed, inside, outside, architecture, nature, public, private, order, experience." Okay. So in this sense, he's starting to these oppositions here. And when you view the Ennis house this way, the Ennis house starts to recall Wright's conviction of the similarity between architecture and music, which is not his alone. That connection is made by many people across centuries of time, even millennia. You look back at ancient Greece and there's people saying there's similarities between architecture and music. So he says certain constants control the development of variations resulting from the differences in each project: site, client, program, material, and structure. Of these constants that he lists here, the most pervasive one, which nearly always dictated the remaining elements, was the material. Okay, and in this case, it was concrete. So in the end, Wright works to resolve, and he resolves to make the Ennis house this harmonious whole rather than a discordant composition. So it's a harmonious whole between material and theoretical elements, between the actual structure and his philosophical ideas. And even today, despite all of the damage and the remodeling and reconstruction, the Ennis house is recognized as Frank Lloyd Wright's one of his most harmonious masterpieces. And both architects and the public recognize this. So the Ennis house is listed on the National Register of Historic Places. In 2008, it was voted by a panel of historians and architects and preservationists as the region's third best house of all time. And there's a lot of good houses here in the Los Angeles region. So that's a big honor. And then even over the years, Frank Lloyd Wright's Ennis house has been shown in countless movies, music videos, miniseries, ads. Filmmakers just flock to this house because of its dramatic and exotic appeal. And in 2008 as well, another architect, Barbara Bester, she built a house across the street, and in like an homage to Wright, Bester designed her street side privacy wall here to showcase her neighbor. Okay. And she likened it, Barbara Bester likened it to putting the Ennis house that you see up above on a pedestal, like an art object. And even in 2019, when Ron Burkle sold the house again, it sold for $18 million. Variety magazine described the house as less of a home and more like a giant work of art that just happens to include bedrooms, bathrooms, and a kitchen. So I think all of these more recent events seem to fulfill, in my mind, the vision that Wright himself had for the house nearly 100 years ago. Okay, so 1924, so 97 years ago, he wrote this. He says, "You see, the final result is going to stand on that hill 100 years or more. Long after we are all gone, it will be pointed out as the Ennis house, and pilgrimages will be made to it by lovers of the beautiful from everywhere." I love that. I love how idealistic Frank Lloyd Wright is. And it has stood for almost 100 years, thankfully, with the restoration work that's been put into it. So we have a couple of minutes left. If you feel, maybe I'll pause my share here for a second, of what maybe I'd love to hear what you think, how effective Wright was in resolving all of these contradictions at the Ennis house, the tenets of his architectural philosophy, or do you think he was successful or not? If you guys have any questions, I'm happy to answer them as well.
I have a quick question.
Yes.
How much of his architecture was influenced by the person that he was creating it for, the family? How much was just his own idea?
Okay, yes. So a lot of it, that's another one. And I didn't get to that. I kind of took that part out because the client, obviously the person paying for it, has a say, right? So let me actually, I'll share the screen with you again really quick. Here at the Ennis house, so Charles and Mabel Ennis, maybe I'll pull up, Wright actually returned back to Taliesin studio before this home was complete. Taliesin is in Wisconsin. And so he left his son to sort of complete the work and work with Charles and Mabel Ennis. And Mabel was getting a little assertive, maybe would be the right word. So she decides she wants marble flooring in this long hallway. Okay, so she's the one responsible for this marble flooring, rather than, let's see here if we can get to another, there's actually wood in the living room. That's what Wright probably would have preferred. There's also things that he designed structurally too. So in the plan, off to, let me see where that plan is. Let me see here. In the plan, you'll notice this structure off to the left in the plan, that was the chauffeur's house. So that's the garage, okay? And then above there was where the chauffeur was, his house was, okay? So he's designing things according to it. And even, as I mentioned before, this house gets passed from owner to owner, and the fourth owner, John Nesbitt, he requested a pool. And so Wright accommodates the client as best as he can, but he also has one more tenet that I didn't mention, and that's called a faithful client, okay? And what Wright means by that is he wanted his clients to trust him completely, to put full faith in Wright, and that he would do the best to fulfill the client's needs, but he never really sacrifices his philosophy to accommodate the client's needs. Okay, another. Let's see here. Another exception to this here at the Ennis house was actually, so you see here in the living room, it's actually a flat ceiling. Wright actually had in his designs a more, I wouldn't say a Gothic-like arch, but it was coming up at an angle and then coming towards the center, almost like a barn type of arch, okay? So it would have even created a grander effect going from that small entryway of only 7 feet high up to this massive, these soaring ceilings, okay? But Mabel was also responsible for the flat ceiling, so sorry, that may have been more than you wanted to hear, but there you go. Other questions?
Does he have any works that are like more on the humble side, or are they pretty much all these grand?
Okay, so this one's pretty grand. It's pretty dramatic, and it's in Hollywood, guys. Okay, so you have to like realize like that's a lot of drama in Hollywood, but he does have more simple concrete block houses. He did 4 of them here. One is called La Miniatura, and it's also in Southern California. It's on a much smaller scale. The Ennis house is the largest one he did of his concrete block houses. And this is, I should remind you too that this is a style phase that he does. He experiments with this concrete block and then he goes on to other things. He's also responsible for the design of the Guggenheim in New York, like that very round museum, you know? So if he is able to get the funds and the site and the client want such a structure, he's able to do it. But he does do more humble structures. I would even say that the the Roby House here. Am I still sharing my screen? Maybe I'm not here. The Roby House that we looked at, and also even Falling Water. I would consider it a more humble type of architecture, very much nodding to the landscape. The landscape takes over here. Nature, it does reign supreme here rather than the structure itself.